I mean, there are an awful lot of things that you can point to in society at present that have a God-shaped hull.
Reset is about going back to the beginning, back to our ancient origin story of Genesis, to see whether that text still speaks to us today. We're talking to Christians and non-Christians, to biblical commentators as well as cultural commentators, to figure out what that ancient text means. In this series, we'll be talking to people like Douglas Murray, like Tom Holland, like Professor John Lennox, Professor Rupert Sheldrake, Professor Miroslav Volf. We're talking to many different people, both inside the faith and outside the faith. And we want to learn whether we can hit reset, whether there's anything to be learnt by going back to the beginning. Today on Reset, it is our great pleasure to be speaking to Douglas Murray. Douglas is the author of many books, including The Strange Death of Europe and The Madness of Crowds, and he joins me on the line now. Douglas Murray, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a huge pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Well, your book, Madness of Crowds, I read it back in 2019, and I found it blistering and hilarious and sobering. And the book seems to orbit around, or at least it describes movements that orbit around some fairly sacred values. Things like equality, diversity, inclusion. Let's steel man that position. And let's, to begin with, talk about the glory of equality, diversity, inclusion, and where do you think those ideas have come from?
Well, my own view is that they consist of, among other things, a spillage from Christianity. We might say an afterglow from Christianity. It hardly needs to be said, although perhaps it does these days, that most civilizations and theories and moralities throughout history do not consist of any particular respect for the individual, any particular respect for differences between individuals, let alone the celebration of that difference being actually the guiding light of such a principle. So in the spirit of what T.E. Hulme famously described romanticism as being, I slightly alter his famous saying and say that the social justice movements, the searching for equalities and all this, is a form of spilt Christianity. I mean, I'm not the first person to have made this point. Obviously, quite a lot of others have, including a number of radical theologians, and some see that as being a good thing. I mean, I'm particularly struck by a theologian who made a lot of impact in the 80s, I think, rather less so in the decades since, but Don Cupit, the radical theologian from Cambridge, actually by the 90s was saying that actually is the precise purpose of Christianity, to become this. So that is, it seems, I mean, we could go into more depth, but it seems to be clearly the origin philosophy from which these movements come. It's got other things added in, but that's the main one. Essentially, all of the easier, nicer aspects of Christianity without any of the hard bits. And I think that what is fascinating about this moment that we're living through is that it seems to me that it is one of those periods historically where you are moving from one metaphysical system to another.
Right.
And not very many people seem to be aware that that is what is going on.
Right.
And it seems to me, just a further thought on that, which is that it seems to me that the handover from a Christian metaphysic to a human rights based sort of metaphysic is rather similar, and actually happens around the same time as the handover of the Anglosphere or the British dominance in the world to American dominance. What I mean by that is that in geostrategic terms, it's quite often said that the remarkable thing about the 20th century is that Britain effectively hands over to America. And it's the most seamless seamless such mass movement in strategic history. Almost never does one great power get replaced by another great power without an even greater conflagration. And I see the handover of effectively a Christian metaphysic to this metaphysics of human rights as being that like that. A lot of people didn't realize it was going on as it was going on. There were people left around regretting it. There were people left around fighting for it not to be the case. But it feels like that is in historical terms what we are living through at the moment.
So you talk about one metaphysical system to another. I mean, interestingly, the very first quote that you begin the book with is by G.K. Chesterton, Catholic author. He says that the special mark of the modern world is not that it is skeptical, but that it is dogmatic without knowing it.
And isn't it extraordinary, by the way, that he said that about the modern world in the early 20th century, but he could have said it in 2020.
100 years ago, right. And so many of his quotes are exactly the same.
Yes.
So
he's a remarkable prose writer, apart from being a remarkable thinker.
Really. He would have nailed Twitter. He definitely would have nailed Twitter. His turn.
I think he might have been booted off quite early as well.
You wouldn't be the first. So in what ways do you think the modern era shows its dogmatism? And in what ways do you think it shows its ignorance of its metaphysical truth claims?
You sure you've got time for all of them? I think the first one is that the human rights-based world order has a terrible chasm underneath it, which everybody can see, and which I do think is an explanation for a lot of personal as well as wider traumas going on in the modern era, which is that you hear of a metaphysical system which is a human rights-based system which is all the time described as though it is what it says it is and claims to be. That is, it claims that human rights are inviolable, but they're violated all the time. It says that they are absolutely fundamental, but they are attacked all the time. They can be attacked around the world with impunity. There are countries after countries, eras after eras in the modern human rights era in which, yes, it's claimed you have the following rights, but somebody comes and takes them all, and nothing happens. That's quite different from a Christian idea of justice, of course, which says, well, that may happen in this world, but there is justice in another place and in another sense. So I think that the whole claim, I've often said that the human rights-based order suffers, among other things, from a form of Zimbabwean hyperinflation, that everything becomes a human right, and yet actually the bits that were in the post-war period set up as a fundamental charter in order to try to address it, even those are, in many countries around the world, highly contingent on circumstance, on birth, on origin, and so clearly they are not exactly what they say they are. Now, you could say, in that case, we should reframe them. We should say that they're not human rights, but, for instance, human aspirations. That would seem to me to be to put them in. Is not perfect, but it would put them in a more reasonable. It would establish them in a more reasonable way, or more reasonable expectations, shall we say? But as I see it, the unwillingness to contend with the Christian origins of the human rights era is very specific. And it's based in a number of things. One is an unwillingness to recognize the particular inheritance and truth claims of the Christian religion, for all sorts of reasons, but one of which in the modern era has become the claim that basically all religions are the same, that they all teach the same thing, and they all have the same virtues. And it's really, you may choose Christianity, I may choose Islam, someone else might do yoga, and there's no real difference between any of these things. I think that's a modern wish, but I mean, there's very little evidence to it's
quite a Christian wish, actually. The Christianized West has kind of forwarded that view, really.
I'd say the post-Christianized West has forwarded that view. It doesn't matter how you get there, as long as you sort of, aspire to climb this sort of ladder to God, you will, and you could do it through, as I say, through yoga or through communion. It doesn't matter much which. But that's a sort of post-Christian idea, or watery, built over Christian. And another reason, of course, is our suspicion in the modern era of exclusivist truth claims. And obviously that, as you know, is something tied up with a lot of confusion that's always been there within the Christian tradition, which is it for us or is it for everybody? And of course, there's a shortcut to the it's for everybody, which is to pretend it already is, and everybody's already got it. So there's a lot going on in our era and a lot of denial. And I think that the denial is what I've just said, and an basically, let me also say, it's an unwillingness to concede where the rights might come from in terms of historical tradition, because non-believers fear that if they make the concession that the rights have their basis in a Christian worldview, what you will do is give great fuel to a Christian revival. And I think that may be tactically correct, it may be tactically wise, but it's not true to make that claim. And I think unwise in some other ways.
Yes. What do you see as, I mean, you've expressed many times a hope that we could somehow depoliticize ourselves. I mean, everything is so fraught. Everything is heightened to the level of a kind of a religious truth claim at the moment. And I think in the absence, after the death of God, there is a power vacuum, and suddenly politics is taking that place, and then entertainment has to take the place, and sport has to take the place of politics. Everything gets promoted. And you've many times said, can we cool our jets a bit? Can we step back? How can we do that without having something else properly in that sort of highest place of our ideals and imagination?
It may not be possible. And I should put that out there, because it's an argument against self-interest in certain ways, but it may not be possible. I mean, there are an awful lot of things that you can point to in society at present that have a God-shaped hole. So maybe it's not possible. And maybe when I describe the change in the metaphysical system that we're currently going through, it may be that change is a boomerang of some kind. It may be that we become something totally different, or maybe we would go back to something that we would recognize. But it may be the case, I just stress this, because it might not be possible to cover over the God-shaped hole. I do think that the various attempts to make other things fill that gap are almost uniformly difficult. I mean, I almost used the word problematic.
Hashtag problematic, yeah.
Not a word I'm fond of, but I've become unfond of because of the people who wield it.
Sure.
But yes, there is something... There is something highly problematic about people replacing God with politics, because you end up with a fervency that we recognize it when it's used in religious terms. You might end up with that same feverishness in political terms, and they may actually make the business of politics impossible, among much else. Precisely because you need the saved and the unsaved. You need the elect, and the elect must have the thing to which to be against. And it's a sort of disappointment about politics in some ways that you learn as you are growing up, but it's probably quite a good thing to learn that it cannot achieve the utopian dream. I mean, it's people quite often moan about the managerialism of politics, and there is lots to moan about, but the managerialist stance is much better than the one when you know that you're in history and are suffering for it.
Right.
But yes, I think that it imbues politics with attributes that it cannot sustain. Of course, there have been other efforts to fill the God-shaped hole. I wrote about one of them in The Strange Death of Europe, which is the obvious one, is the attempt, particularly in the 19th century, most persuasively performed by Wagner and his compositions and his operas, to fill the God-shaped hole with art. And that has its own problems. And its own risks. And I'm not only thinking of the ones that Wagner personally went through.
So let's dive down into the madness of crowds. And you use the analogy of you are going to clear the landmines by tripping over as many of them as you can.
Yes.
Which you then proceed to do with some glee and abandon, I'm sure. But you go through, is it gay, women, race, trans? Is that the order?
Yeah, that's it.
I was fascinated by beginning with a story of some conservative Christians who were putting on a documentary about conversion therapy, which I'm sure both you and I have questions about, perhaps for different reasons. But I've got a friend who, she's actually part of this series called Reset. I'm interviewing her. She went to Yale. She was an atheist and gay. And stole a copy of Mere Christianity and was converted and found herself, after many twists and turns, married to a man called Andrew, happily married. They have a child. And what I find difficult is, if she had asked me to pray for her at any stage of her developing romance with Andrew and said, can you pray that my heart would, turn towards Andrew? That could be criminalized if that's considered to be conversion therapy. And yet, if she asked me, can you pray that I would become Andrew? That could almost be celebrated. There seems to be the idea of an interchangeability of gender and the absolute fixity of sexuality. When I think instinctively, most people think it's the other way around.
What you touch on is very, very interesting. As you know, I'm all over this subject because I'm interested in the things that the age waves through without question. And I say in the gay chapter of Madness of Crowds, while starting off with this group who made this film about so-called gay conversion therapy, that I'm much more willing to listen to their arguments than many people, particularly most gay people, partly because I'm just curious about curious arguments, and partly because, as I say there, I think there are questions that were left behind. And that's consistent in all of the issues I address in the Madness of Crowds. It's consistent in the women's chapter. Say, what are the questions that feminism left behind as too difficult to address? The obvious one, I say, like Camille Paglia, the obvious one is motherhood. Feminism jumped along on a whole range of things to do with, equal representation on boards and so on, and really never worked out what to do about motherhood. And as I say in the Madness of Crowds, that's a biggie. That's a biggie to jump over. And in the gay chapter, yes, I say something along the lines of what you've just said, which is we have a set of odd ideas about this. One is that the gay is a one-way street, which it may be, and there's a lot of evidence to demonstrate that it is. That there is, however, considerable diversity, and the largest form of diversity in that is between men and women. This is a conversation I've had in the past. I think people can find on YouTube with Brett Weinstein, the biologist, about why it may be that women are more sexually fluid in this way than men. The shorthand example I give is you can quite often find somebody who's a lesbian who's had bad examples with men, and that may not be the only reason she's become a lesbian, but it's quite a strong one that she seeks to be with another woman. You never meet a man who's had bad experiences with women and as a result becomes gay. Who wouldn't have been had they not met the wrong woman, sort of thing. Now, all this is incredibly dangerous and contested terrain, perhaps. But I say, look, why have we said it's so straightforwardly a one-way street? Are we absolutely sure about the nature of how sexuality is formed? And the answer is no, we're not really. I think the evidence increasingly points to the fact that it is biological, or at least determined from the womb, from very, very early age. But there are also possibly some societal factors that might be at play. And I don't see why we shouldn't be able to discuss them, other than that they tread on some what have become sacred values. And I'd add one other thing, which is, of course, the obvious reason is this fear that if you do address them, then you'll go back to, the horrible times that have existed in the past, and in some places exist still, where young gay people are effectively sort of tortured by alleged professionals in order to become something they just cannot become. But yes, the example you give also exists in the trans one. And I've written about this a lot, because the era now says, if you're, I don't know, a young, slightly effeminate boy, likelihood is you're really a girl and should be given medical help to become a girl, and vice versa. A tomboyish girl is really a boy. And that's, of course, not only against a lot of issues to do with women's rights, but a lot of things to do with gay rights. And it is very offensive to a lot of gay people. And so, but the point of saying all this is to say this whole thing's a great big blooming mess. It's very messy terrain. And I think that it's unwise. It's wise to try to be as kindly to people as possible and to listen to their concerns. It seems unwise to me to dig in and embed narratives that have not actually been proven.
Right.
And I worry about any shutting down that's total like that. So, as you say, the conversion therapy example is tricky, because you may make it illegal for somebody to suggest that somebody might be happier being straight. And as I say, like in the case of your friend, that's more common among women. But at the same time as you make that illegal, you make it illegal not to approve of a child being in the wrong sex and therefore medically transitioning at a later stage. That seems to me to be a very demented set of things to have going on at the same time. So I'm just interested in opening that up. I think we need to know a lot more until we're as certain as we're currently pretending to be about these issues.
Right. So you move from the gay chapter to the women chapter, and again, here is a prime example of equality and diversity, and how it is that we can we have a space for the particularity of women? Can we still name what the feminine is? Can we name what the masculine is, without having a hierarchy to say one's higher than the other? Can we blend them? Can we bring a unity? It's a real struggle. Where do you think we go wrong as we try to get this unity and diversity over the sexes?
The relations between the sexes one is absolutely central, because it throws a light on the problems we're having in the other areas as well. To Steelman, I think that the aim of good people of the social justice movement is something like the following. It is, nobody should ever be held back from achieving in their life what they can achieve by dint of some character trait over which they have no say. Now, I absolutely agree with that aim. And I think the polling would show that very significant majorities in countries like ours have the same view. It's a long time now since you had majorities thinking that, like, a smart woman shouldn't go to university or shouldn't, if they're capable of a high-flying job, perform that high-flying job. And I think it's some time since people claimed that people who were gay, for instance, couldn't perform certain tasks that they could perform. And that people who were black shouldn't perform tasks they could perform. There are people, I don't deny that. There are always, residual, pockets of unpleasantness and prejudice. But I think we have honestly, in countries like Britain and America, we've got majorities on our sides to say that's really the aim. That the aim is that nobody should be held back from doing anything that they have a competency. at, but then we get into the real problem. The left says, broadly speaking, that any remaining inequities, that is, if there aren't enough women in a particular position in a particular industry, there is only ever one explanation, and that is male sexism. If there aren't, and it's the same thing, if there isn't enough gay representation in a particular field, then it's because of homophobia. And if there isn't enough racial diversity, then it must be to do with racism. And broadly speaking, the right hasn't particularly known what to do with these claims, because the right tends to be scattered by fear at the accusations coming its way, the accusations of homophobia, sexism, misogyny, racism. And I submit that one of the reasons we're in the confusion we're in is because we have not allowed ourselves, I think the left is responsible for this because of its amazing ability at excommunication and heresy finding. It has not allowed us to have the conversations we need to have about this, and specifically that these are clearly not, and there's one could go at this from almost any direction, but these are clearly not totalistic explanations in the way that they are holding themselves out as. For instance, it is not just terrible sexism that explains why there are not as many female firefighters as male firefighters. It is not that every year thousands of young women in Britain fling themselves at the fire brigade union, begging to be allowed to climb up ladders and go into burning buildings and pull out cats and people and much more. It is that there must be other things at play as well. In the same way, if you said, why are there not enough male kindergarten teachers?
Right, that's the example I was about to suggest. Yeah.
Would it be helpful in any way to pretend that the problem was that just like hordes of male kindergarten teachers every year fling themselves at closed kindergarten doors and just aren't allowed in by bigoted women who want just to keep the train to themselves? It's obviously not. Now, I select their two extreme examples. But forms of this, if we agree that there are certain things that people have aptitudes for, then one must recognize that exists in other realms as well. Mm-hmm. The problem is most realms are a little bit more complicated than the kindergarten teacher or fire brigade examples. Mm-hmm. And I fear that we've made all this terrain much uglier, much nastier than we needed to make it, because we've only got this one explanation still. Hmm. And that's for lots of reasons, but one of them is our era's deep and understandable fear of what you might call biological determinism. Hmm. We have a deep fear of it, which is not only reasonable, but I think legitimate. And so we trample down everything that looks like it might be a biologically determinist argument. Mm-hmm. We do that with the sexes. We do it very, very vociferously with everything to do with race, for reasons that hardly need to go into. But that's the darkest corner and the worst. But I think you could say the same thing about gays in certain industries. Mm-hmm. And really, what it always shows is what you can come back to, because I'm keen that one finds a way that people can unify around common aspirations. If we do have this common aspiration, how can we get there? And I would say that it is by recognizing that if we create the conditions that allow people to do whatever it is they have the competency to do and to attain that goal, we must, almost as payback for that, must accept that certain other factors will mean that there is not equity in the distribution of roles.
Right.
And I think we're grown up enough to have this. I think we're grown up enough to say, we would dislike it if a woman competent to be a firefighter wasn't able to do the job and wasn't given the job. And we would dislike it if a man able to be a good kindergarten teacher didn't get allowed in because of that. But that does not mean that we should be aiming for 50-50 sexual representation in these industries or any other.
Right. I see a problem here in that what we've done in secularizing the image of God, or whatever we've done in terms of having a concept of human rights and equality, is that in the absence of a God who values us, the value must somehow be seen inherently. It must be seen materially, so that then it becomes about, do you have the same amount of stuff and in exactly the same regard?
Yes.
So we've traveled quite a distance from, Genesis 1 verse 26, and God made man in his image, male and female, he created them. And he blessed them, and he said, be fruitful and increase in number. And instantly, the first thing God says in Genesis 1 is there is a unity between the sexes that involves complementarity, that involves distinction and particularity, and romance, and therefore difference and equality. And what worries me is that when you take that element out of it, equality just becomes, do I have the same amount of stuff as that group? And if I don't, I go to war.
Yes.
And it becomes a zero-sum game at that point.
It can do. I mean, there's a lot in what you've just said. I mean, the first is obviously the secularized version of mankind as being in the image of God is that mankind becomes a kind of godlike being on its own terms without a God. And there's been a lot written about that, and it's a dangerous position to be in, not least because there's no break on a lack of humility. The specific idea of the image of God, of course, is the origin of this very idea that there is something sacred about us as beings, that we are different from the ant and different from the antelope and every other creature on earth, that we are born in the image of God is now you could say, of course, that this is only an inheritance of Christianity. I think that Christianity has this inheritance because, as other traditions do, because it does say something to ourselves about ourselves, which we intuit, and that's to do with consciousness and the specific nature of human consciousness, which is the thing observing the thing. And this leaves us with this irreconcilable human dilemma always, which is, what is this thing that we are capable of observing about ourselves? God is obviously the image of God idea in Christianity explains that. It gives you the origin for that. As I say, I don't think it is something that is exclusive in the Christian tradition. The Christian tradition of it, the Judeo-Christian tradition of it, is a very, very profound one. I think it answers this deep, deep question within ourselves. And the Judeo-Christian tradition has an extraordinary amount to claim for itself in answering it in this fashion. Whether it's true or not, and obviously a believer believes it's true and a non-believer doesn't believe it is, but I think that it does speak to and reveal a very, very deep truth, perhaps the deepest. As for the complementarity, I've written about that before. It's yes, and it's something which we again don't want to recognize, because again we fear what will happen. Our whole age is replete with these things we won't do because we fear what will happen if we allow people to do them.
Yes.
Ideas we cannot explore because we fear that the implication if we allow the exploration to commence. The obvious one of that one is, if you say that men and women complement each other, you will be doing a number of things. And I mean, I can rattle a number off the top of my head. You might be being homophobic.
Mm-hmm.
You might be being transphobic. You might
Mm-hmm.
be, but more significantly, in numbers terms, what you might be doing is saying to women, the ideal for a woman is to be at home, be a mother, and so on. And so for these reasons, among others, we don't want to have the complementarity discussion.
Right.
And yet it's one of the ones that everybody knows that. It may not suit everybody. It certainly doesn't suit everybody. It visibly doesn't suit everybody. But a very large number of people it will do. And it shouldn't, it seems to me, therefore, be cut off as an option by an age that believes it's doing so in the name of tolerance.
Right. And you lose the crunchiness of an equality that can include distinctions and that can include the gift of the feminine to the masculine and the masculine to the feminine.
Yes.
And instead you have uniformity.
Yes, but I mean, in my case, I'm intrinsically opposed to. I don't like human uniformity. I like difference. A lot of people who say they like difference really just want everyone to be the same, but like them. But I mean, I do actually think that it's fascinating seeing the way that different people think. And there are certain trends that we do correctly attribute to one sex over another. And there's nothing wrong with that, it seems to me, unless it was then used to limit what somebody was capable of doing in their lives. But, you know, why do we know that if a 2-year-old falls over at a birthday party, it will be the women who will run over and seek to comfort the child most swiftly and best, I would submit. This isn't to say that men can't do it. And again, if the building's on fire, this sort of thing gets you into trouble, but you don't grab the nearest woman and say, get in there.
Yeah.
I'm not saying they won't.
Yeah. If I hear there's a burglar downstairs, I don't nudge my wife and say, Emma, I went last time, it's your turn.
Exactly. Very good example. Yeah. And as I say, I think there might be just in the same way that there might be a risk from having admitted such things, there could be a risk from admitting such things. We should admit that there might be a risk from not admitting such things.
Yes.
And that just as we could thwart lives by being overly deterministic, we could also thwart lives by trying to ignore this. And by the way, I can give a very good example of this, which is one that's on everyone's mind. Women get to a certain age, obviously in their late 30s and early 40s, and if they haven't had children, they have a different call from that which exists in men. Now, you may say that's because of a roughly 20 or more year biological clock difference between the sexes, but there seems to me to be a considerable argument, considerable force to say, actually, the cost of not having these discussions is seen in things like women in their early 40s who've devoted their whole life to their career and have done really well and have climbed the ladder, realizing that they are not going to have children or are going to find it very hard to have children. And that seems also to me, that's quite something to have on your conscience as a society or a group, to say, actually, we misled some people. It doesn't matter how many, in a way. We misled some people about what how this ran.
Yes. One of the great consolations of life, not the only, but one of the great ones.
Of course.
So we want equality with diversity to include the particularity, but somehow to get to a unity. And I often think, interestingly, the way that certainly in the Judeo-Christian tradition it gets developed, it doesn't just get left in Genesis 1, but perhaps the great verse in the New Testament that's often brought up when it comes to equality, even though the word equal is not there. It's Paul in Galatians saying there is no male, no female, no Jew, no Gentile, no slave, no free, for we're all one in Christ Jesus. And I think what's fascinating about that is you get actually a community in which the oneness happens. And of course, you don't ignore the fact that someone's from a Jewish background, someone's from a Gentile. You don't ignore the fact that there's a man and a woman. it's the fact that you've actually been brought around the same table in this Christian idea, to share in the same meal, to be welcome at the same banquet, which again is something that I just don't get when I hear modern secular demands for equality, because it's just, I need the same stuff.
It's I do the same stuff, and it's also, I could only understand people who have the same traits as me. One of the enormously impressive things of Christian civilization is exactly what you just pointed to there. And by the way, I mean, I should say it does have copies, but in other traditions. The Muslim concept of the Ummah is a very good approximation of the same thing, and is moving for precisely the same reason, which is that anybody, be they rich or poor, wherever they're from, are brothers in this faith. And it's a powerful thing, whichever tradition you take it from, because it is, of course, one of the only answers of how the self can be as effectively not dissolved into the community, but to become a part of a community on lines other than the only other available ones. And the only other available ones are nation, tribe, which are different things usually, but they have a crossover, tribe or nation, and then otherwise with a modern obsession, which is you are a member of the identity groupings you happen to be a part of, which is of course, although in the modern case only if the grouping in question is the approved kind. So it's good to be identifying yourself as black, but we would not look kindly on people who said their primary identity was that they were white. In the same way, we don't have much sympathy in our society for people who say that they feel straight pride, but we do feel sympathy for people who say they feel gay pride. And again, it's quite common for people to say, I'm so proud to be a woman. It's strange, if not unusual in our societies, to say I'm proud to be a man. So in our own era, yes, the identity grouping is most commonly that, as long as it's not centered around a majority trait other than womanhood.
Yes.
And yes, these are, well, yes, as I say, this obviously St. Paul's great insight about and his ability to universalize the faith. Is obviously what transforms the Christian religion.
And I think there's a kind of a doctrine of God going on in the background too. Colin Gunton was a philosopher at King's College, and he wrote a book, The One, the Three, and the Many, which was kind of a survey of Western philosophy, talking about it as the tug of war between the one and the many. You've got Plato with this unifying force, and the Aristotle being the particularizing force, and how do we mediate between these in all sorts of areas, metaphysics and ethics and ontology and political philosophy. There is this great tug of war between the one and the many. Yes. How do I find a brotherhood or a community in which I can be myself and be one with the other? And I think the doctrine of the Trinity gives a fascinating unity in diversity. Kind of here's the archetype. Let's say here's the highest value for a Christian society. The particularity of the Son of God is not dissolved into the Father or dissolved into the Spirit. And yet the Son can never be without the Father, and the Father can never be without the Son. There is something about a unity and diversity that I think Christian civilization has taught us, which again, I think without that, you get the tug of war between either uniformity or hierarchy and war. But let me move on to the race issue, because obviously, since the hardback came out in 2019, I was about to say, is race one of the areas that you've seen sort of most development in over the past year? But it's quite a competition between all four, isn't it?
Yes, but I mean, race is definitely the winner in being the one that's thrown to the fore most clearly, most visibly.
Yes.
I think the weaponization of all of the identity traits I'm talking about has gone on with considerable abandon in the last year.
Yes.
And I refer to this in the updated paperback edition. But obviously the one that has now become most domineering, you might say, is the question of race. And it's one that I tackle, I address carefully. I think it requires care. But I'm very, very deeply worried about where we're going on this. And I'm worried about it because I think that we are in the process of re-racializing our societies in the name of anti-racism. And the most obvious example of that is that going back to your question about your point you make about community, you can either dissolve yourself in a civic community, or you strip that back, dissolve that, and go back to some other form of belonging. And it seems to me almost impossible for a society to encourage some groups to do that on racial terms and not on others. So it seems to me that if unless you take the view that quite a lot of people do, and I identify as being the issue of overcorrection, that is, in the same way that gays have been repressed historically, let's give the gays a bit of run of it now. Let's let them be sort of more for a bit. In the same way that you could argue that because women have been, in some ways discriminated, certainly kept from certain roles in life in the past, let's let them get away with some stuff for a bit that men can't. And in the same way, the most obvious example is, since there has been racism historically, and certainly in predominantly white societies like Britain and America, certainly famously in the case of America, American blacks have certainly not had the opportunities available to American whites, which isn't to say that American whites have had an easy time throughout American history either. But because of that, why don't we allow black pride to run for a bit, just as we allow gay pride to run for a bit, just as we allow feminism in its perhaps worst forms to run on for a bit? And the problem of that is that you just see there's an almighty car crash coming down the road, which is you don't know when the overcompensation has gone on for long enough. No one will tell you, and you wouldn't know who to listen to and who you'd believe. But I believe, for instance, it is just not possible to argue that some people should feel deep pride in their racial origin and other people should feel deep shame. And I don't think that's possible in any direction. I stress this, in any direction. And it's also, even if it was desirable, and it never is, it's highly undesirable to say that one racial group of people carry historic guilt and another do not. Highly undesirable to say that one group is better than another, or morally better than another, or in any other way. But this goes back to the very fundamental questions of our time. This is, again, because we don't trust ourselves. We don't trust ourselves with racial difference, and we try to say that the only ways in which it exists is when it exists in a positive light. That is, X minority racial group have a particular ability to do Y. We trust ourselves with that because it's a positive. We don't trust ourselves with, and X racial minority group seem to do more of B, which leads to C. We won't do that if it's negative, and for understandable reasons. But it means that we are running several programs simultaneously, and it doesn't take a genius to notice it. You're running racial total similarity and racial betterness in specific cases. And I think that, for instance, in a country like America, where Black Americans only constitute 13% of the population or so, I don't see that you can persuade a majority population for a very long time that they should put up with being told that they are, for instance, demons, which I watched a video of one a white, anti-white
yes, I saw
diversity officer in an American firm telling the employees. Yes, I just don't think, I wouldn't sit in a room and be told that by dint of my skin color I was a demon. I would certainly stand up for any of my Black friends, brothers and sisters who were told that by somebody else. I would expect every other good person to as well. I wouldn't want it to happen in any direction. Don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it said about any racial group of people by dint of their race. And I think it's highly unwise to allow such overreach to continue when you are still talking about the majority.
Yeah, and again, there's the particularity of the tribe and the nation that we take pride in. We naturally, I'm Australian. I take pride in being Australian. There's all sorts of national pride and the unity point, and how do you in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul looks back to Genesis and he says, "From one man God made every race of men," bringing back a great unity to Adam.
Yes.
I think there's that very interesting, many people sort of say, in the Bible, there's one race, the human race, and there are very many tribes and peoples.
And this, of course, as you know, I mean, and your listeners, I'm sure, will know, is the foundation on which Wilberforce and the anti-slave campaigners were Christians based their moral argument, which was that it was an immoral and unchristian thing to regard your brother in this light. And again, that is a moral insight that is not common throughout history. There is a particular reason why Christian countries like Britain in particular managed to lead the way out of slavery, a horrible human evil that had existed in every civilization since the beginning of time.
Right.
But there is a reason why it is able to be thrown off and indeed campaigned against by the Royal Navy, which is that Wilberforce and others have the moral case based in a Christian idea of the similarity, the sameness. It's not just similarity, the identical nature in the eyes of God, apart from anything else, of the people who were being enslaved. And that's what led to the incredibly rich tradition of the black churches in America. It's what led to the rich tradition from which Dr. Martin Luther King emerges. And it's the thing that gives him the central, most important moral insight of the late 20th century.
Right. Which is in danger of being reversed. Yes. We are judging people by the color of their skin and not the content of their character.
Something that the great fraud, New York Times bestseller Robin DiAngelo actually tells people to do. She actually says to people that it is immoral not to judge people by the color of their skin.
Yep, and sells millions. Let's move on to trans, and I guess you probably tackled trans last because in so many ways it's one of the thornier issues, and I'm sure the research you had to.
Well, all of them are kind of thorny. I mean, you go, you gave yourself an easy pass doing race, Douglas. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, talking about men and women's a doodle.
Yeah. But then, but of all the if you had to name, we did here a Google survey, anonymous survey of unsayable opinions, and we collected 2,500 unsayable opinions. Half of them had to do with trans. So half of so well over 1,000 unsayable opinions were about trans. In terms that 10 years ago would have been incomprehensible to any of us. So it does stand out in some senses, doesn't it?
Yeah, of course. It stands out in a lot of senses. I did it last actually because of several reasons. One is that it's the most minority of a minority issue. And the second reason is you actually have to know all of the other things that have happened in the other areas to understand how the hell trans has come to be what it currently is in terms of the galvanizing issue. I mean, an issue that affects something less than 0.05% of the population is 0.5% of the population is very, very hard to get everyone interested in unless it treads across everything else. And I do trans last because it treads across everything else. And people haven't been willing to admit this. It clearly runs. It doesn't. The intersectionalists, to use the dreaded, ugliest word of the era, the intersectionists pretend that all of these things, all rights claims interlock, and to address one, you address them all, and if you solve one, you can solve them all. And one of the things that demonstrates that intersectionality is a total crock is that even on its own terms, it doesn't work. And I explain the Manson crowd, I expose how that is the case. That intersectionists claim that if you unlock women's rights, you unlock trans rights. And that ain't the case. Quite the opposite. They seem to run very, very much against each other. There are big fears among a lot of feminists, quite rightly, about what trans is doing in terms of setting back women's rights. There are a lot of gay people, increasing number of gay people, who are very worried that trans is, and we touched on this earlier, fundamentally against gay rights. That is, that the L, G, and B are totally separate from the T. not least because, again, a young, tomboyish girl may, all of the small amount of evidence we have so far on this suggests is very much more likely, if she is diagnosed with so-called gender dysphoria, to grow up to be a perfectly happy, healthy lesbian or a happy, healthy heterosexual. She does not need to be surgically transformed into an approximation of a male. And of course, the idea that she would be is something that terrifies a lot of lesbians, for instance, who think, gosh, if this was going on when I was growing up, and the opposite case, vice versa, with gay men. So trans is unwittingly running against all these things, but it's more interesting because of what we're not, well, several things. One is what we're not talking about in the trans thing, and what we're not talking about is sex, and that didn't used to be the case. As I say in the trans chapter, trans used to be intimately tied up with sex. I'm trying to choose my terms carefully here.
No.
Anyhow, trans used to be intimately tied up with sex, and today, actually, trans actresses totally divorce their activities from sex. They say it has nothing to do with sex. Right. Couldn't be more boring. Right. Nothing we want less, and that's just what brave academics have been willing to make the studies about that show. That's just not the case. A portion, at least, of people we call trans are interested in attracting their own sex in a different body, for instance, and a portion are people who just get a kick out of effectively a sort of sexual kink. Autogynephilia, as it's rather unmemorably called. These are really complex, but actually very, very interesting terrains about the nature of human sexuality. I find them interesting for that reason, among others. I think it's very, very interesting that we have, in our era of tolerance and diversity and all that sort of thing, actually ended up making people's sexual preferences much, much more streamlined and straightforward than at any previous time. Almost, we are pretending that, you know, if you're born a man and you like men, well, we can make you into a woman, and then you can like men as a woman, for instance. Yeah. That's got a lot of problems in it. The other thing is that, and I wrote this recently in the Times in London. One of the interesting things I noticed about the trans thing, which is why it caught on so much, was that I noticed it among my scientist friends first, who often rather, you know, always very cerebral, often rather, you know, shy creatures who, you know, spend the time in the laboratory. I noticed that these vole-like creatures, I'm almost portraying them as, but when they emerge with something that disturbs them, you know, it's always worth listening. I mean, you know, us humanities know nothings. You know, have lots of things that disturb us. But when a scientist says this is a problem, you know, you particularly should listen. And I noticed the number of scientists I knew who were saying, I can't do it. And it was that they were being increasingly asked by their institutions to agree that, for instance, there's no such thing as gametes or chromosomes. Wow. And they just couldn't do it because it was, and I mean, it's not just to do with people who are dealing with diseases, which actually knowing the chromosomes of the person is very helpful. And I mean, you know, even a man who becomes a woman is not going to get ovarian cancer, and a woman who tries, you know, to transition to a man is not going to get testicular cancer. And I mean, these are maybe obvious examples, but there are many, many others of illnesses that are to do with your sex. And so it wasn't just to do with that. It was an even deeper thing than that. And the deep thing was scientists who I started to notice was saying, it's the first time in my life or my career that I've been told that the scientific method does not reign supreme.
Right.
That the era has dogmas that science must bow to. Right. And that is the thing that made me most concerned, makes me most concerned too. And it's why I won't do it. It's why I won't shut up on this issue or any other. Yes. Because I think it's profoundly dangerous to give over your most useful tools for analyzing very specific things. And just one other thing, which is that the reason why I think that your 1,000 people had questions on this is because of the other thing. The people are now quite comfortable to talk about the overlap with feminism and trans. It's got easier. It's got easier thanks to a small number of people to speak about the overlap between gay and trans and the way in which they run against each other. The one that is unpopular still but needs far more attention would, I bet, be the one that you've heard from people, which is parents. Mm-hmm. And parents are not getting enough of a say in this, and they are being intimidated, and I think it's outrageous. And part of the point of the trans chapter is to give voice to the parents who have been put in a terrible position. And I don't think that position is because they've discovered they've got a trans child. There are all sorts of issues. I say I'm open-minded on all of this. I'm open-minded to the fact that there is something in very, very small numbers of people which we're nowhere near understanding. But it's nothing like the numbers we're talking about. There are clearly people being diagnosed as being gender dysphoric who are no such thing. And the worst thing is the attempt by so-called medical experts to pretend they know things they just don't know. And in the process, I think, wreck a lot of young lives. And one other thing from that is the number of parents, and I've heard from a lot of parents since the Madness crowds came out, who have said to me, and occasionally when we were still able to have events, would come up to me after events and say thank you, because I had from a lot of parents who said what I had mentioned in the book, that medical professionals are telling them, you either agree to everything your child is saying and the alleged experts, who I really don't think are expert in this field, are saying, or you will have a dead child.
Because they'll commit suicide because of bigotry.
These alleged experts are actually blackmailing parents with the death of their children. You know, they're very, very common. I got familiar with all of the trans cliches. And one of them is, do you want, if you have a son, do you want a happy daughter or a dead son?
Wow.
What a way to talk. How dare they talk like that to parents?
Yeah.
And think they're doing so in the name of being tolerant or understanding.
Yes.
So I tried to speak up for those parents, and I spoke to a lot of parents when I was researching, and I've heard from a lot more since. But I think it's that is most on people's minds, and parents should not shut up about this. By the way, if I can make a call for anything in this podcast, I'd like to do it for that. Please don't be quiet about these things. Please don't keep it unsayable. It has to be said. I wrote in the Mail on Sunday last weekend about what the former gay rights group Stonewall, which has now become a kind of anti-gay, pro-trans lobbying organization, is teaching. What its teaching packs say, it's totally delusional, it's wrong, deeply misleading, it's very confusing for children, it should not be taught in schools, and I think that it needs parents to say that. And if more of us said it, I think we would get a lot further. So my real urge is, please, 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 if you are a parent, don't keep this as something you whisper or write in anonymously, to a podcast. Make it something you raise with other parents, with teachers, with schools, because we are in danger of embedding a very, very bad narrative.
Well, that's a good word for all of us. Douglas has already gone across the landmines. He's tripped them all for you. Let's join him.
And by the way, it's very pleasant tripping.
Yeah?
I should stress that. It's absolutely. People stress all the time. They're like, oh, it's so dangerous. Oh, it's so risky. It may be for some people in certain situations. But broadly speaking, I can't tell you. It is much easier to tell the truth than many people in our era think it is.
Yes.
And I also think that if we all share the burden in saying things that might be seeming to be unpopular, it'll become less of a burden and easier in due course.
Yes, and there's always a risk in not telling the truth as well.
No, it's much worse risk for your own conscience.
Right. Douglas, I must let you get on, but people would be very. They would think I'm very remiss if I don't ask you. With your own, Christian journey, and we've talked about Christian civilization giving some sense of the unity going forwards. You want to depoliticize us. You want us to unite around something else. Would you like to see a revival of Christianity in the West? And how about in your own life?
I regard myself as being in an open-minded state on these things. I genuinely, I went through a dogmatically atheist phase, as a lot of people do after they lose faith. And I believe myself, to the extent I can be, to be open-minded and open-hearted, I might even say. And that's the advice I give other people. I think, in lieu of anything else coming along, I can't see what else could come along. I occasionally say to friends, I preferred the old gods to the new ones. And if you do come to that conclusion, inevitably it means you'd rather have a bit more of recognizable Christian faith in your society than the weird stampeding neo-faith we have at the moment, which is embedding itself and is confused and foundationless. But my own belief is, I wrote about this, I think, in The Strange Death of Europe, in some depth, if I say so myself, that I take Cardinal Ratzinger, as I always still think of him, his advice, Pope Benedict's advice to heart, which is that one should live as though God exists, and that one should, the most important thing, actually, this comes up in the Ratzinger-Habermas dialogue on the dialectics of secularization. One should make sure that philosophy and religion are in dialogue. And that, in my own life, is the way I think about this. I believe they have to be in dialogue, and there are things that philosophy can answer, and there are things that religion can answer. And they are overlapping magisteria. They're not completely overlapping. But yes, I also think, by the way, that in the case of Christianity, the most important thing is living by example. I don't put myself out because I can't profess to be a practicing Christian these days. I don't, in that case, or in any other way, put myself forward as an example to anyone. But I do think it's very important that Christians live by example, because that is, in my own experience, how people are most drawn to faith, is to see that other people, it's not about living their life in happiness or contentedness, but that they live by example as the manifestation of the faith. And that is beyond reason. That seems to me to be the most likely way for that to happen. I say that personally as well as in a wider field. I do feel very disappointed when I see Justin Welby unable to defend his own faith. And I have been in extraordinary situations and seen extraordinary Christians in countries around the world, including in very beleaguered places, whose example has been among the most extraordinary things I've seen, and one of the great privileges of my life to witness. So I do think that that you know, in a way, the call to Christian living is also the answer to Christian proselytization.
Yes, yeah, and those communities of Christian living, they are the salt and light that Jesus spoke of. We shouldn't be looking for a top-down savior, but this kind of bottom-up movement Absolutely. Of faith. Douglas Murray, you've been so generous with your time. I'm so grateful.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you. I'm so pleased to have had this conversation, and thank you for it.
Oh, pleasure. And everyone, run out and get The Madness of Crowds. It's out as a paperback now.